Go over here and twirl it.
Caitlin Fuller, September 16th, 2012, informative speech. Anyone can get post-traumatic stress disorder. Combat is a cause along with many other causes, and there are many symptoms that go along with it. Soldiers in combat are the only people who can get post-traumatic stress disorder. This is not true. Sadly, people think that soldiers are the only ones that can get post-traumatic stress disorder. Today I would like to talk to you about post-traumatic stress disorder because soldiers are not the only ones who are susceptible to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. The three main areas of focus today will be who can get post-traumatic stress disorder, the causes and the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And I will refer to post-traumatic stress disorder as PTSD from now on. Let's begin with who can get PTSD before we study PTSD more in depth. PTSD has become more prominent with the war going on, but this is not the only way to get PTSD. Children who have suffered from abuse of any sort or rape are susceptible to early onset PTSD. Early onset PTSD is when a child or early adolescent suffers from a trauma and in turn gets PTSD. According to Sherry A. Stewart, Valerie V. Grant, Paige Omit, and Pamela Brown, quote, "Girls were 10 times more likely than boys to have been raped, and boys were twice as likely as girls to have experienced a sudden injury or accident," end quote. This comes from the article, Are Gender Differences in PTSD Rates Attenuated in Substance Use Disorder Patients, from the Canadian Psychological Review Journal. Sudden injury or death experiences can cause PTSD because children are unable to cope with these events. It is hard for children to accept them and move on from these events. Rape can be traumatizing for both boys and girls, but it is more common in the girls, which we can see when they develop PTSD. The authors of the article previously mentioned also said, quote, "Women were more likely than men to have been physically assaulted, sexually abused, or raped, and women have experienced a greater number of lifetime traumas than men," end quote. These situations could have happened to these women when they were younger, and recent events could have triggered memories of this traumatic event and could cause PTSD. This PTSD is called adult onset PTSD because it happens when they are an adult. The authors of the previously mentioned article also said, quote, "Women are about twice as likely as men to have PTSD," end quote. In reality, women are more emotional, but this is not the reason why women are more likely to have PTSD. According to Jessica M. Pierce, Christopher K. Berkey, Kenneth B. Stoller, and Karen J. Neufeld, along with Robert K. Bruner, women, quote, "Women are at a greater risk for PTSD in part because they are more likely to experience traumatic events that convey a higher risk of precipitating PTSD," end quote. This quote is from the article Assessing Traumatic Events Exposure, Comparing the Traumatic Life Events Questionnaire to the Structured Clinical Interview of DSM-4, from the journal Psychological Assessment, a journal of consulting and clinical psychology. Although women are twice as likely as men to get PTSD, men can also suffer from PTSD. Men are more commonly suffering from PTSD because of time in combat. Men who have PTSD do not act like themselves anymore. They have a different view of themselves, as do others. According to Russell B. Carr, quote, "Soldiers or Marines are seen as dysfunctional automatic thoughts, a shattered self, and a regressed ego," end quote. From the article Combat and Human Existence, Toward an Intersubjective Approach to Combat-Related PTSD, from the Psychoanalytic Psychology Journal. Combat is the main cause of PTSD, but what about it causes PTSD? Carr also said, quote, "Unendurable traumatic emotions force upon the traumatized person the realization that he or she is alone in beating an unpredictable death, and that the death is unpredictable or indefinite. Each person knows that they are mortal, but the probability never before that traumatic experience have felt it," end quote. Combat-caused PTSD is really caused by the feeling of pure and apparent mortality. which can only be expected when you are in battle. Other causes of PTSD are abuse, rape, trauma, traumatic injuries, and traumatic experiences, as previously mentioned. Another addition to these causes, according to Stewart, is crime-related trauma. All of these causes revert back to the feelings of mortality, and being abused or raped, there is definitely a feeling of possible death. Traumatic injury and experiences can also make you feel the same way. Crime-related trauma can happen when a store clerk is held up, when a person is mugged. They do not know whether or not the person committing the crime is there to hurt them or not. According to Richard T. Saunders, quote, "There is no shrinking of the extent of psychopathology attributable to traumatic experiences," end quote, from a clinical handbook practice therapist manual for assessing and treating adults with PTSD. The article is from Psychotherapy Journal. This means that small events can cause large damages. Before the cause of PTSD can be discovered, whether or not a person has PTSD must be determined. Looking at symptoms is the main way for this to be determined. According to the American Psychotic Association, quote, "Recurrent distressing dreams, images, or thoughts of the event, along with reliving the event, having hallucinations, and dissociative flashbacks are some symptoms, along with distracting at exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize some part of the event," end quote, from the DSM-4. These are all severe symptoms because they can alter the way a person lives. According to the same source in the DSM-4, quote, "Avoiding thoughts and feelings or conversations of the event, along with avoiding activities, places, or people that arouse the trauma are acute symptoms. Also, the inability to recall the event," end quote. These symptoms are more acute because the person is not completely altered and they are still able to do everyday things without being scared. PTSD can be scary, but knowing that anyone can get PTSD, you know that you're not alone if you have PTSD. By having a better understanding of what the causes of PTSD, a person can begin the healing process. And by being able to recognize symptoms, you can help yourself and others go to the doctor if they may have PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder doesn't have to be scary. By remembering the information, you can overcome or help others overcome PTSD.